Hello and welcome to the third webinar by Search for Common Ground on Countering Violent Extremism. In this webinar, we will look at the importance of engaging community leaders and families in countering violent extremism programming and policies. Now, the need for engaging these kinds of leaders and members of the community is really part of our need for an all-of-society approach, which we discussed in the first webinar. And that's because they're natural partners in building the individual resilience of those that are vulnerable to the appeal of radicalization. Now, we work to reduce that vulnerability by building the resilience of groups and individuals. When we say resilience in the individual sense, we mean that it's the capacity of a person to reject the idea of violence or violent extremism, even when it may be tempting, by leveraging personal protective factors and by reducing or removing personal risk factors. Now, this is different than community resilience, but has a lot of similarities. But we define community resilience as a community's positive capacities to reject violent extremism and having effective mechanisms for being able to prevent it, identify it, intervene against it, and contribute to the disengagement of those who come to support it or engage in it. In a way, community resilience is like the body's immune system, which protects us from getting sick. Like a healthy body, a resilient community has the tools to identify a problem and respond to it in a way that doesn't tear itself apart and that leaves us healthier and stronger and more immune to the problem after we've worked to address it. So community resilience really is the importance of building the right tools and relationships and even the response mechanisms that would help a community to address the issue of violent extremism and to, in turn, build the individual resilience of its community members. Now, when we begin to build an all-of-society approach to countering violent extremism, we can ask ourselves these guiding questions here. First, we need to evaluate what's already being done in our communities to ensure a locally driven and an all-of-society approach. This means spotting where community mechanisms or relationships are damaged or absent, and then working to better resolve those issues. Second, what are the most important local community actors that we are not engaging enough? Now, too often we can actually tend to engage only sometimes with those particular members of the community, such as religious leaders or the police or some other community actor, but we haven't actually considered that there may be others out there that we haven't considered yet that actually may have strong positions in the community and actually could have great relationships with those that we would be most interested in working with and partnering with. So think of youth workers and social workers or any other members of the community rather. The third question, how important do you believe religious leaders are to these efforts? And this is because violent extremism has plenty of different forms. And therefore we should really ask ourselves whether religious leaders in the community have the right relationships to, especially with those that are vulnerable to violent extremism, in order to offer guidance and support when it's needed. And finally, what are the unique ways that families can help make their members more resilient to the appeal of violent extremism? This question prompts us to think about the kinds of relationships and the qualities that a resilient family, like a resilient community, would have to address issues that they experience. Now, let's look at an example from Morocco. In this video by Search for Common Ground, you can see the example of religious leaders in this Moroccan city as they work to build resilience to violent extremism in their communities. So as you watch, try and look for the ways that violent extremism affects these communities and how they're working to build resilience. You can access this video by clicking on the picture on your screen. Now let's consider the role of families. In this following video by Women Without Borders, you'll be able to explore how this organization's Mother's School platform works to empower mothers to better promote the resilience of their children and even their communities in a variety of ways. Try and pay attention to the different ways that these women are able to intervene in their families and in their communities to build resilience. Like the last video, you can access this one by clicking on the picture on your screen. Now, as with all countering violent extremism programming, we should pursue this work with a do no harm approach. So let's consider some of the risks and how we can best avoid them. Now, if we don't have these do no harm approaches, our work may actually lead to further marginalization and even discrimination against the vulnerable communities that we want to work with. Second, if we don't build the capacity of local organizations that we want to work with and partner with, really, we may actually set them for failure by not preparing them to implement their projects or monitor for results. Third, we may sometimes have self-appointed community gatekeepers that would come to us and ask that we conduct programming through them. Now, this can sometimes be a local political leader or religious leaders or some other figure in the community. But we may not be able to have a true all-of-society approach if we're only going to work with these specific gatekeepers. We have to manage that relationship, because if we don't involve them as well, then they can actually become spoilers in the process. Finally, not recognizing the limitations of families, religious leaders, and other community leaders can actually lead to marginalization or perhaps even laying some blame against them for radicalization that occurs within their communities. We can't expect that everyone will be able to always perceive and intervene in the process of radicalization. So we should really apply a community resilience framework in these efforts rather than seeking to place responsibility or blame on certain parts of the community, because we really are truly all in this together. Finally, as we finish this webinar, we'd ask you to consider the following key takeaways. First, resilient communities have many defensive factors that are already at play that help them to be safe, to protect them from violent extremism, from intervening in cases of radicalization. And so really, we should begin by identifying those good resilient factors and building on them so that we understand what's working well already. Now, because violent extremism is a highly local and contextualized issue, our efforts to counter violent extremism are often more effective at local levels rather than through top-down approaches. This is connected to the next point, where government actors, when they collaborate with local communities and listen to their needs, we can actually repair any relationships that have been damaged. This can sometimes happen when top-down approaches make communities feel targeted rather than partnered with. We should also consider both male and female religious leaders as important partners in this effort, but we should bring them together as part of a broader network of community leaders so that we really promote this all-of-society approach. Now, resilient communities are similar to resilient families in that resilience on this level means that families have the ability to address the issues that they face, but also to strengthen the individual resilience of their members. Finally, local and grassroots organizations face barriers to fully participating in the countering violent extremism field. This is true because local organizations can be very small. They could have only started operations for a short time, or they may have been more limited to specific activities, and the field of countering violent extremism may be new to them. So therefore, we should prepare them as partners so that they can be set up for success. That's all for this webinar, but in the next one, we'll explore how we can better increase collaboration across different sectors of society. Thank you.